Welcome to Alexandria, a Hellenistic World podcast. Episode 2, Ptolemy the Macedonian. It's 322 BCE. Night has fallen on the young city of Alexandria, but all is abuzz. You are weaving past bonfire after bonfire, all set up in the broad canopic way and in the market square at the city's center. So many bonfires that the light has drowned out the stars. All around you echoes a cacophony of drums and cymbals and rattles, of papyrus reed flutes playing alongside that droning Greek pipe, the aulos. Wine is flowing, mixed in those giant bowls, poured out by the ladleful. You would think it's a proper festival day, one devoted to Hathor, mistress of music and dance, or maybe the bearded god Bes, protector of pleasures. But this is all impromptu, a spontaneous celebration. The tyrant Cleomenes is dead, and you, Unnefer, as you and your son make your way to a lone bonfire off the edge of the market square, have found the man who did it. The executioner, still dressed in his Macedonian armor, is sitting, drinking from a shallow cup, a kylix. On his left sits a woman, wearing what looks to you like a Persian dress, covering her from neck to ankle in simple earth tones accentuated by a bright blue belt flashing from the fire. She's holding a kylix cup too, but you can see the wine still in it, perfectly still, like the waters of Lake Mareotis when you often go fishing in early morning. Before you can greet them, though, you see someone else. She sits comfortably on the other side of the fire, a simple ceramic cup in her hand. She's beautiful, but how is she here? Your wife meets your gaze and smirks. Tia, you start in your native Egyptian language. What? How did you? 'Cause I know you, she says. I know you're curious by nature, and I knew you'd take your time looking everywhere else before going to the most obvious place. You hear a chuckle. Your daughter pokes her head out from behind your wife. She's got a cup in hand, too. A day brew, you assume, with a lighter color and taste and content. You shake your head. I thought, just because we missed the execution, your wife says, doesn't mean we can't take part in the festivities, right? And besides, she glanced now at the man in Macedonian armor. I was curious too. You nod. You summon your best Greek, and you say, you are the one who did it. The executioner, your son, supplies the right Greek word, already seating himself beside his sister. The executioner looks up from his empty cup, and his eyes light up from the flame. Aye, that's me, he says, hand chosen for the task by the satrap himself. You feel yourself jolt. The satrap. Ptolemaios, you sound out. That is why I'm here. Do you know him? What is he like? Will he be good, or will he be a bad one, an evil satrap like Cleomenes? The executioner laughs. Believe you me, he's a good one. A soldier like me, But he's interrupted, because on his right, another man stands up. I can answer those questions better than you, Thrason, he says, and you know it. The executioner, Thrason, has paused with his mouth wide open, mid-speech. But he just smiles again and leans back like he's waiting his turn. This new interlocutor turns to you now. Sit, please, he says, and you do as he says, making sure not to spill your beer. This one, he's dressed in a simple tunic, a bit worn down, and underneath the tunic you can see his chest is broad, his legs long and spindly, weirdly proportioned. He's the herald, you recognize, the one on stage who announced the crimes of the condemned Cleomenes. I can tell you who Ptolemaeus is, he says, where he came from, and how well he will govern. I can tell you because despite my appearance, I know him well. You see, Ptolemy and I were born in the same town in the same year, the first year of the child king of Macedon, Perdiccas III. Those were dark times for our homeland, Macedonia. Our old ruler had been killed, and a regent puppeted the child king. For our first years, of course, we knew nothing about that. We grew up in fertile Aordia, in the mountains of western Upper Macedon, far from palace politics. My family did not give me money or land or many skills. I inherited from my father strong lungs, a clear voice, and swift legs. He gave me his grandfather's name, Eurybates, wide walking. At home, my father did not speak much. He had to rest his voice, for he spent most days relaying messages. You see, Ptolemy's father, Lagus, was for a long time just as poor as us, but he married into wealth, for Ptolemy's mother was connected somehow with the palace. A cousin, I think, of the child puppet king, or maybe of King Philip. Nonetheless, Ptolemy and his brother Menelaus grew up on the same diet as my own. He ate lentils grown in the valleys and tripe, sheep intestines, stewed in vinegar. As his father rose, my father rose too, employed as messenger to and from well-to-do families of the fertile mountains. We were not yet 10 years old when the Illyrians, that tribe from the western mountains, invaded. Our king, no longer a puppet, now a fully grown man, went to meet them, and he was slaughtered, the king and 4,000 men. The Illyrians were gearing up, we heard, to invade our homeland, Upper Macedonia, both them and the Paeonians too, both barbaric tribes of the northwest. My mother had us pack our few belongings, and we bore our swift feet up the mountain slopes. They arrived, and at first we waited for them to pass, to simply raid the countryside, but then they stayed. The Illyrians had conquered us outright. They stayed a full year, a year I'll never forget, and we did our best to survive. They would have stayed permanently too, but soon we heard whispers that turned to shouts, when a cloud of dust peeked over the mountains, coming up from the coastal valleys of Lower Macedon. An army bigger than we'd ever seen, thousands and thousands of men marching right past us into the upper mountains. They were Macedonian, but they looked different. I was used to armies of conscripts, a seasonal militia, called up for war and sent back to their fields after, and armed with the traditional hoplite spear, like the Greeks to our south. But even from afar, I could see that these men, they marched in perfect formation, a drilled and trained mass bristling like a hedgehog. They each held spears longer than I'd ever seen, longer than seemed even usable, newly hewn ash and bright iron tips glittering as they passed. Who had gathered these men? Who had trained them? I found out later. You see, when the young king Perdiccas was killed, his baby son was crowned king, and his younger brother was appointed regent. But that didn't last. Perdiccas' younger brother declared himself king. His name was Philip II. King Philip transformed our world. With this new reformed army, he crushed the Illyrians. He brought our homeland, the mountains of Upper Macedon, back into his fold. We were safe again. I was so excited to return home, for things to go back to normal, to eat our lentils and tripe. But it was not to last. King Philip had indeed transformed our world, and the army was just one part of that. Because soon, when Ptolemy was just 10 and 4 years old, my father returned from one of his rounds to and from the capital with a message. Ptolemy was being summoned. We, of course, followed the family of Lagus, the Lagids, to the palace at Pella, because Ptolemy, as a teenager of the new aristocracy, would become a royal page of the palace. He joined a new group of coevals, and from 14 to 18 years of age, all the sons of King Philip's court nobles together served the king. Everywhere he went, they went. And royal hunts, they rode or walked beside him. If he needed his horse, one brought it to him. If he needed company, they were his to command. They guarded him as he slept. During symposia, the royal parties, they served him our thick Macedonian wine, nothing like this watered-down stuff here. And after the parties, one or two of them would satisfy his every desire. Yes, every desire. To his credit, Ptolemy took it well. He learned to fight, to hunt, to ride. He was also educated, him and all the other Paides, the noble teenage servants of the king. Educated in the Greek fashion, to speak the southern Greek language of Athens and Sparta, to read and understand philosophy and history. But for better or worse, Ptolemy was never a favorite for the king's physical needs. You see, his was an easy face to remember. Even back then, his chin jutted out, his lips pouted and fleshy, his nose large and crooked like an eagle's beak. His eyes were bright then. He hadn't yet killed. And me, I was taught to run and to yell, my father's trade. In time, my father took on duties that required only his strong lungs, less so swift legs. For those latter duties, I took his place. So there in the halls of the palace at Pella, Ptolemy and I both grew, both became men. My own son was born there in Pella, some years after Ptolemy graduated from the noble Paideia education and took his place as a bona fide noble of the king's court. You see, Ptolemy may not have been a looker, but he had impressed the king enough to be appointed as a friend of Philip's young son, the prince. That prince, Alexandros, had only been 3 years old when we first arrived, but the king was determined to surround him with the best possible friends, with sound advisors who would serve as stout companions in war and in council. By the time my son was born, that prince was about 10, and a few years after that, the king managed to snag a truly great boon for his education. If you know any Greek philosopher friends, I reckon it is this man, Aristoteles. Yes, Aristotle himself tutored the young prince, along with his designated friends, in a sacred cave, a temple to the nymphs near the capital. Ptolemy was 20 and 5, if I remember correctly, and as a designated friend of the prince, he was one of those privy to the philosopher's teachings. Or so I suppose. I never was allowed to approach that sacred cave myself. And know this, friends. In my opinion, Ptolemy to this day is a man of cultivated learning and wisdom, a man that cherishes those who love knowledge. So we grew, and our homeland prospered. But the rest of Greece was not so happy at our fortune. Yes, there were some, like the orator Isocrates, who supported the king in his mission. But others, like that wretched Demosthenes of Athens, did all in their power to stop him. They can quibble about the details, but the way I see it, the Greeks broke the peace. They declared war on us. The prince had just turned 10 and 8 years old, if I recall, the age when Macedonians are first sent into battle. And Ptolemy, his designated friend, went out to fight. I joined Ptolemy as herald. My father, like his, stayed behind. We left in the heat of late summer, marching south from Macedon towards the territories of those rebellious cities, Thebes and Athens. But then nothing happened. For 1, 2, 3 months, I ran back and forth, conveying messages between Ptolemy and his father, south to north to south, until heat gave way to soft winds, then to blasting cold. I told Ptolemy's father, Lagus, of the skirmishes on the frontier, of a little battle on a river, of another battle in the winter, all running into harsh north wind. Until, finally, the king forced their hand. There is a village on a road going toward Thebes, and on that road, the Athenians and the Thebans and their allies stood against us, all proud and haughty, led above all by that wretched Athenian Demosthenes. Ptolemy disappeared into the lines of King Philip's army, and I prayed by Zeus that he would survive. Then I climbed a hill nearby, myself and all the other camp followers, and watched. It seemed to me that both sides were evenly matched, almost exactly the same in number, but certainly not in training. Our army was already battle-hardened, setting out every year, east and west and south, ever since Philip took the throne. The Athenians, those citizen soldiers, had nothing on us. No, it was the Thebans I was worried about. They had the sacred band, 300 men, elite heavy infantry. Each of them was paired up 150 pairs of lovers. The rumor had it that they were unstoppable, that each lover was ready to die 1,000 deaths before ever deserting his beloved. Which made it all the more surprising to me that it was our left side, the side commanded by the young Prince Alexander, that broke through against the Thebans. Our right side was commanded by King Philip himself, and he seemed to be retreating, marching back onto higher ground, and the Athenians facing him gave chase. But just as I began to fret, that mass of long spears whirled back around, and from the high ground, the right flank under Philip crushed the Athenians. By the end of it all, the enemy was annihilated, and Prince Alexander had massacred the entire Theban sacred band, all 300 of them. My trip back home to Pella was the easiest it had ever been. I was glad to deliver the news, glad still to hear from the other heralds what happened down south after I left. King Philip had marched down to Corinth, and there he had established a league that would include all of Greece. He was hegemon, leader of that league, and at his behest, the cities of the Greek world declared their mission. Finally, after all those years of planning, Philip was going to invade the empire of Persia. When Ptolemy returned to the capital, he too was giddy with excitement, as was the prince. But it seemed in that moment that Ptolemy might never get to go east, because he and the Prince Alexander had made a huge mistake. You see, messengers arrived from the east, not for the prince, but for his older half-brother. His half-brother was challenged. I could never tell how, but despite being older, he seemed to have difficulty learning and speaking. He was never in line for the throne. But the satrap, a governor in the southwest of Asia Minor, had offered his daughter's hand in marriage to that elder Prince Eurybates. This terrified Ptolemy. If Eurybates was married to a princess, would he become heir apparent? So Ptolemy and the other designated friends of the Prince Alexander hatched a scheme. I don't know the exact details. Somehow, the Prince Alexander sent his own herald and convinced the satrap to give his daughter to him instead. When King Philip found out about this, he was furious. The marriage was cancelled, and one by one, the designated friends who had planned with the prince were singled out. Ptolemy was among them. He was banished, not just from the palace, not just from Alexander. Ptolemy was banished from all Macedonia. He was some 30 years old, the prince about 20. And I followed him. After tearful goodbyes, his only messenger to and from his old homeland. The army of King Philip prepared to march east, but Ptolemy and I trudged west into exile. Welcome again, friends, to Alexandria, a Hellenistic World podcast. You just heard a story about Ptolemy the Macedonian, the future satrap, king, and pharaoh of Egypt, founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty. You, Unnefer, heard about Ptolemy's childhood in Upper Macedonia, the mountainous region to the west of the coastal plains that formed the core of the fertile Macedonian heartland. Ptolemy and his herald, our friend Eurybates, were born in about 367 BCE and raised in a world dominated not by Macedon, but by the Greek city-states to their south, by Athens and Thebes and, to a lesser extent, Sparta. Macedon was weak when they were children, until, as Eurybates told us, the King Philip II came to power in 359 BCE. Eurybates witnessed one of Philip's earliest campaigns, his reconquest against the Illyrians. Philip II could be the subject of an entire podcast. But for now, just know that he really did transform their world. I cannot stress enough just how bad of a position Macedon was in when Philip first took the throne. The kingdom was beset by Illyrians from the northwest, by Paeonians, another tribe from the north, both ravaging their lands. Thracians from the northeast were gathering their own army, intent on installing a pretender to the throne of Macedon, and Athens had a different pretender also ready to invade from the south. The army had just been completely wiped out. It needed to be built basically from the ground up. But if there was one thing Philip II turned out to be great at, it was diplomacy. Philip was a fantastic liar. We don't fully know how, but somehow, one by one, Philip managed to delay or prevent all these different invasions with bribes and gifts and treaties, and, at least in one case, by marrying the daughter of the Illyrian king. Meanwhile, he revamped his army, and just a year after his assumption of the throne in 358 BCE, he marched into Upper Macedonia, defeating the Illyrians and securing the homeland of our friend, the herald Eurybates. What Eurybates did not see was all of Philip's subsequent campaigns. From Illyria, Philip invaded south into Thessaly, a fertile region known for breeding good horses. In the following years, Philip gradually invaded and took the lands surrounding Macedon, ping-ponging back and forth between the lands to his east, south, and west. So first, he went east, comprising Amphipolis, the peninsula of Chalkidiki, and the North Thracian coast of the Aegean Sea, from roughly 357 to 354, again around 352, a third time in 349 against the city-state of Olynthus, and a fourth time from 342 to 339, all the way east to the city of Byzantion on the Bosporus Strait. That's modern Istanbul. In the years between these eastern expansions, he further expanded south, inserting himself into an ongoing struggle called the Third Sacred War, which, long story short, resulted in Philip gaining full administration over that horse-rich region of Thessaly and gaining indirect authority over the cities to its south in Boeotia. If you're keeping track, that means Philip almost never spent a single year without some campaign, whether in the east, the south, or a couple times also to his west. All this success came at the expense of another power, a city-state you may be familiar with, Athens. Those conquests in Chalkidiki, most of those were Athenian allies. Amphipolis, an Athenian colony. In Byzantion in 339, Byzantion was the last straw. It was the gateway to the Black Sea where Athens got all of their grain. Philip's conquests had systematically deprived Athens of resources and allies, and it all culminated at Chaeronea, Philip's crowning battle in 338 BCE. Now, Athens wasn't the juggernaut empire that it had been a couple generations ago, at the height of the Peloponnesian Wars up to the end of the 400s BC. But during Philip's reign from the 350s through the early 330s, Athens was a solid power player, on equal level with Thebes and Corinth, and even more powerful than Sparta, which had lost its own domination after everyone else in Greece teamed up against it. Which brings me to Ptolemy. One problem we will have when talking about all of Alexander's later successors is that we are sorely lacking any good info about their early lives. But as we will see in future episodes, we are relatively well informed about Ptolemy. That's because Ptolemy himself, later in life, wrote a history of the campaigns of Alexander from Macedon to India and back. That history doesn't survive, but the histories we do have, those written later by Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, and especially Arrian, among others, they used Ptolemy's as one of their main sources. So the good news is, we know a lot about Ptolemy's perspective on these historical events, or at least the perspective he wanted to record for posterity. But the bad news is, we sometimes only know Ptolemy's perspective, and in other cases, his perspective clearly differs from other accounts. Our friend the herald Eurybates is just as biased, which is convenient for me as a writer, but it also means that we should take some of his opinions with just a tiny grain of salt. The problem is, Ptolemy really comes into focus in the historical record later, during the campaigns of Alexander in eastern Persia from roughly 330 onward, when he gained his own leadership positions. Until then, much of our understanding is incomplete at best. So, for instance, we're reasonably certain that Ptolemy was a basilikon pais, a royal page from 14 to 18 years old. We know the duties of these royal pages, as our friend Eurybates discussed. But one page he didn't mention is a certain Pausanias, and his story will be important going forward. Unlike Ptolemy, when Pausanias served as royal page, he was apparently a looker, because King Philip is documented keeping him as a favorite for his sexual desires. But this Pausanias grew into adulthood, and King Philip lost interest. Now the story gets a little complicated from here, but just know that this Pausanias, now a young adult, ran afoul of an important Macedonian general and courtier named Attalus. Attalus the general decided to get revenge on Pausanias by inviting him to a party, getting him raging drunk, and ordering his slaves and friends to all sexually assault the defenseless, barely conscious Pausanias. Now, when the king Philip learned of this crime, he made his own fatal mistake. Attalus may have committed a treacherous assault, but he was an important general, and the king needed good generals for all his constant wars, much less his planned invasion of Persia. So King Philip did not punish Attalus. Instead, he merely promoted the spurned and traumatized Pausanias, his former lover no less, to the prestigious position of somatophylax, one of the king's personal bodyguards. So do remember this Pausanias, who is now serving as Philip's bodyguard, and in all likelihood fought alongside the king at Chaeronea. Back to Ptolemy then. We know that the royal pages served alongside the king in battle in their last year of service at 18 years old. If Ptolemy did so, his first campaign was probably at Olynthus in 349. But his attested role as a royal friend of Philos of the young Prince Alexander complicates things. That word friend, well, that might be a bit misleading. As the herald noted in his story, Ptolemy was about 10 years older than Alexander. When he joined the prince in his studies under the philosophers Aristotle and Anaximenes, he was already about 24 compared to Alexander at around 13. I don't imagine a 24-year-old having much to talk about with a 13-year-old, much less an adult from the rugged mountains talking with a prince more or less raised in the palace. Ptolemy's role as designated friend was probably more like an advisor than a role that would almost be his undoing. So, with this age difference in mind, we don't know for certain if Ptolemy participated directly in any battles before Chaeronea. Alexander isn't mentioned in any battles until he himself was 16 years old in 340 BCE. Ptolemy probably accompanied him when the 16-year-old prince was left by his father to subdue a revolt by some Thracians just a little east of Macedon. As the heir apparent, the young prince is credited with taking action and expelling the rebellious Thracians, even founding a city or maybe a military garrison named Alexandropolis. But, well, that town didn't survive long, and we can guess that the 16-year-old had substantial guidance from his much older generals and designated friends, Ptolemy perhaps among them. In any case, Ptolemy certainly was present 2 years later at Chaeronea in 338, and he took part firsthand in the slaughter of either the Athenians or the Theban sacred band. After Chaeronea, though, it doesn't seem like he was able to stick around for long. The year after Chaeronea, 337, had Alexander at his most rebellious, his most headstrong. In fact, Eurybates didn't mention that Alexander himself was very briefly banished, probably in late 338 or early 337, before being recalled back just 6 months later. That was for a public spat between Alexander and his father at one of his father's many weddings. It was to prevent exactly that sort of outburst that the King Philip had appointed the level-headed older Ptolemy and the other friends of the prince. They were meant to advise him soundly, to make sure he was a good prince, conforming to the king's wishes and conforming to the education bestowed upon him by his philosopher tutors. So I can't imagine King Philip was very happy when, just months after his son's own return from exile, he learned that Ptolemy and several other friends, and maybe even Alexander's mother Olympias, had advised him to go over the king's head and arrange his own marriage. Philip explained to his son, probably through gritted teeth, that his potential bride, the daughter of that satrap, was never meant to marry the heir apparent. Her father, the satrap, wasn't important enough to waste a marriage with Alexander himself. Now, the Macedonian royals practiced polygamy. Philip himself had many wives, but Alexander's first wife would in all likelihood produce his own heir. So Alexander not only went behind his father's back, he'd also made himself look like a complete idiot. And Ptolemy, his friend and advisor, was one of those to blame. King Philip banished all of the so-called friends from Macedon. Where Ptolemy went, we have no idea. We don't quite know when he returned either. He probably missed the most important event in Alexander's life. Eurybates will tell us all about it from his own perspective. But, spoiler alert, King Philip II never got to invade Persia himself. In 336 BCE, just 2 years after the Battle of Chaeronea, 1 year after he declared his mission to invade East and around the same time banished Ptolemy, King Philip was murdered. His killer? The spurned bodyguard Pausanias. See, I told you he'd come back. But any chance to hear him out was lost because Pausanias was also killed while trying to get away. The young King Alexander, just 20 years old, was crowned king on the spot to prevent any semblance of succession issues. But he was in for the fight of his life. After holding a funeral for his father in Aigai, the old capital of Macedon, a little south of Pella, Alexander knew he would need to go to war. All those enemies his father, King Philip, had either defeated or tricked or assuaged would take this chance to revolt, to attack, to regain what Philip had taken from them. Alexander, in that moment, needed good generals. He needed loyal soldiers, solid advisors. More than anything, he needed friends. It's probably here, then, that he recalled those friends banished by his father, Ptolemy among them. We are about to move on, then, to Alexander's wars against all his circling enemies, and finally to the siege of Thebes in 335 BCE. And here, too, we have a slight difference in accounts. You see, other sources tell us that Alexander himself ordered one of his generals, a man named Perdiccas, to sneak around and attack a rear gate of the city. They say that Perdiccas followed orders and succeeded, although he was heavily wounded. But Ptolemy, well, Ptolemy tells us a different story. The bonfire roars, and you, Unnefer, realize that you haven't drank from your cup since the herald started his story. You look over and see your son and wife are just as entranced, your daughter less so. But the herald has paused, deep in thought, recalling, you assume, those dark days when his patron Ptolemy languished in exile. Too much for you, the executioner, that soldier Thrason, has long since downed his wine, and he's gotten his slave to go refill his Kylix cup. Don't worry, Eurybates. I can take it from here. Like I said, Ptolemy was a soldier, so... No! The herald's voice rang, his lungs as strong now as they must have been back then so many years ago. You will have your turn, Thrason, but this part is for me to tell. Thrason closed his mouth this time, as if he had expected the herald's reaction. He sat back down, smiling. The herald breathed in and spoke. Gathered friends, those days in exile were Ptolemy's darkest. I invite you to imagine, for a year, we didn't know if Ptolemy would ever get to return. King Philip had already sent an army under his general Attalus east over the Hellespont Strait to establish a foothold in Persian-held territory. The messages I conveyed back and forth became ever more somber. Until, one day, I arrived to the palace at Pella in turmoil. Just down the southern road at the old capital of Aigai, a whole host had gathered. For the wedding, I asked, but no. Those amulets and sacrifices for celebration had been swapped out for mourning garb. The King Philip was dead. No one really knows why it happened. They had just held a beautiful wedding between King Philip's daughter, Alexander's sister Cleopatra, and the king of Epirus, the kingdom to our west. After the wedding, King Philip entered the town's theater and stood alone, basking in his accomplishments. And in that moment, one of his bodyguards approached. I think his name was Pausanias? Either way, he stabbed him in the back. The king fell instantly, and the killer, conveniently, didn't get away, didn't live to tell us why he did it. But I have my suspicions. I reckon it was the Persians. They were scared, rightly so, of the mounting invasion. But the Persians, if they really bribed or convinced that guard to kill him, had no idea that they had unleashed something much worse, someone much worse. I ran back from the palace along the roads and paths west with the most important message of my life. I was the one, I, Eurybates, who told Ptolemy the news. Your friend Alexander is king, and he wants you back. Ptolemy had just returned when the campaign began. It was a flurry of marching and battles and marching again. First south, back into Thessaly, re-subjugating those men who breed good horses. They went down to Corinth, and young King Alexander was acknowledged hegemon, leader of the League of all Greeks, just like his father. But that wouldn't last long. Now the Thracians rebelled, northeast of our home, and Ptolemy fought battle after battle, on mountains, through streams, all the way north and east to the Danube River. Then west, back into Illyria, because those brutish Illyrians once again revolted, once again threatened Ptolemy and I's homeland, the mountains of Upper Macedonia. There in Illyria, Alexander won again twice. But during all that fighting, all in the span of 1 year, the Greeks down south were plotting. It was that wretched Demosthenes. He somehow convinced his Athenians and everyone else that Alexander had died up in Illyria. It wasn't true, and any good herald would have exercised his judgment against repeating such rumors, but the damage was done. Athens and Thebes once again revolted. The other cities of Greece were wary, and rightly so, because Alexander did something simultaneously unexpected, yet completely in line with his father's wit. He ordered all his soldiers, all the camp followers, me included, to march faster than they ever had. It wasn't a problem for me. Running was my skill, my work. But Ptolemy and all the others were almost exhausted by it, a whole forced march south from Illyria straight to Thebes. But the gamble worked. We arrived in just 2 weeks, and the Thebans were completely unprepared. The army of King Alexander surrounded the city. Now, people seem to remember what happened next differently. This is what I remember, what I saw, and what Ptolemy told me afterwards. Alexander wanted peace. He tried to accept surrender, and even when the Thebans stubbornly refused, he waited to attack. It was Perdiccas, one of Alexander's young generals, who attacked first. He charged with his own phalanx of men, unordered, disrespecting that young king. After him, another general followed, and the fighting had started. They broke through the palisades, but then they were trapped. Perdiccas himself was wounded. King Alexander had no choice but to save them. He routed the Theban attackers, and as the Thebans fled, they opened one of the 7 famous gates of the city. That was their mistake. The Macedonians charged through the open gate, and the city fell all at once. I never saw what happened to the city. I only heard the screams all the way from my hilltop vantage, only saw the smoke and dust rising. The whole army, Ptolemy among them, poured through the 7 gates like a flood. I heard afterwards that men, women, slaves, children alike, everyone, even those who took refuge in the sacred shrines, were slaughtered on the spot or captured. For this, friends, was my father's last task as herald for Ptolemy and his father Lagus. As the battle wound down, as one by one soldiers leaked out of the burning city, they brought with them captives. Ptolemy brought his own, and so did all the men of his unit. And for the next 3 days, my father's one task was to stand and speak to auction. Every single Theban who hadn't been slaughtered was systematically led out of the city in chains and sold. The people of the surrounding region, Boeotia, the people of Greece, the merchants of the Aegean Sea and far beyond, all swarmed the city like cockroaches. Some were families, come to ransom their kin, but most were just opportunist slave traders. And by the 3rd day, my father's voice had gone. I had to take over. Something in my father broke that last day. He had planned to accompany us, but now he decided otherwise. We stood on a hill overlooking the leveled ruins of Thebes, and he told me, "You go, Eurybates. You and your son, you follow Ptolemy, but I will stay behind." And so on that hill, we said our goodbyes. For King Alexander, by sacking Thebes, by completely razing it and enslaving all survivors, had made all of Greece submit all at once. Up on the hill, I looked past the ruins toward our destination. Alexander would finish his father's mission. Ptolemy was going east. Thank you for listening to Alexandria, a Hellenistic World podcast. I'm, of course, very new to this, so please give me any feedback or suggestions. You can find me on Twitter at Alexandria_pod, on Instagram as Alexandria.pod, or on Blue Sky and YouTube as simply Alexandria Pod. You can find bibliography, more contact info, and other goodies on my website, alexandriapod.wordpress.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in Alexandria.